Good morning, boys and girls. I'm your pastor for today's children's sermon, and I think you all know my name. My name is Cindy. Now, what I'm about to tell you today, I find a little bit difficult to explain, so I just want you to bear with me here, okay? I really want to read the scripture to you that this story comes from. And I know it's a little bit long, so your sermon's going to be a little bit longer than usual today, but I know that you can handle that, okay? So I'm reading out of the book of John in the New Testament. I'm in chapter 2, and I'm reading verses 12 through 22, okay? So starting at verse 12, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed for a few days. So we're talking about Jesus. He went to this town named Capernaum, and his mom and his brothers and his disciples were with him. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and in the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip of cords, and he drove out from the temple area both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers, and he overturned the tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous signs can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and, Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken us 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple that Jesus spoke about was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Okay, I think that might be a little hard for some of us to understand, so I want to explain it to you. We all like to think about Jesus as very loving, which of course he was. We think about Jesus as always being kind and just always being kind of level with his emotions. And in this scripture, it sounds like Jesus got a little bit angry. Would you say yelling at those people and turning the tables over? He even made a whip. He got the animals out of there, and he kind of yelled at them. And sometimes when we yell, we're a little bit angry. Well, does anybody know why Jesus felt this way, why he got upset? It's because these men in the temple were selling things. And it's not so much that they were selling them, but that they were making a huge profit on what they were selling. And they were doing it in God's house. And it was a time for the Passover. Many of the people that came to town for the Passover needed an animal to sacrifice. They did this in the Old Testament days, sacrifices, where they bought an unblemished animal, or they had an unblemished animal. They put it on the altar, and they burned it as their sacrifice to God. Well, many of them traveled so far to get to Jerusalem, to get to the temple, that they didn't bring the animal with them. They bought it when they got there. So these men set up tables in the temple to sell these unblemished animals, but they jacked the price way up. And it's like, okay, we're going to make money off of something that we're supposedly doing for God. So Jesus saw this, and he just instantly was just very upset, very angry, because this was his Father's house, the temple, just like our church is God's house. And we're not supposed to do things in it that defile or make it dirty, or, and I don't mean physically dirty. Like, yes, we have to run the sweeper and things like that, but we shouldn't be making money off of things that we're doing in God's name. So Jesus made this whip. He got the animals out of the temple, and he told the men, get these out of here. You're turning my Father's house into a market. And the marketplace was an okay place to sell things. That's what a marketplace is for. But the temple was not for that. And Jesus got them out of there. Well, this made the people in the temple upset. And they're like, well, what authority do you have to do this? And Jesus said, destroy the temple and I'll raise it back in 3 days. Now, logically, that sounds very difficult because you can't really build a temple in 3 days. But Jesus wasn't talking about the physical church building temple. He was talking about his temple, his body. And so he was telling them that once I'm crucified, I will raise up in 3 days. And that's the building of the temple that he was talking about. He also turned over the tables. All the money went scattering across the floor. So the people knew that he meant business, and he wanted them out of there. He wanted the temple to be used for godly things and to worship God and to pray to God, and not to be selling God. So we can learn several things from this passage. The first thing that we learn right off the bat is that Jesus did not want people selling God. The second thing we can learn is that Jesus had the authority as God's Son to cleanse the temple. The temple was God's house. Jesus is God's Son. So that gave Jesus the authority to tell those men, get these animals out of here, get this money out of here, get your tables out of here, go to the marketplace. This temple is not a marketplace. The third thing that we learn from this is that Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection. And it tells us this in verse 19, where it says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, the people listening to this, just the ordinary people listening to this probably didn't quite get it. But the disciples were kind of understanding what he said. But then after his crucifixion and his resurrection on the third day, the disciples all said, oh, he told us about this. Jesus told us this was going to happen. Remember when he was in the temple that day and he had his whip and he got upset and he got all those people out of there? He told us he would raise the temple in 3 days. And that's what's happened here. And that's what happens at Easter. So when Easter gets here, we'll hear about this again, about Jesus dying on the cross, about him being buried in the tomb, and about him being resurrected on the third day. So this scripture that I found a little bit difficult to explain to you, I hope that you can remember these things. The first thing I want you to remember is that Jesus did not want people selling God, especially not in his temple. The second thing I want you to remember is that Jesus had the authority as God's Son to cleanse the temple, to keep it clean. And the third thing I want you to remember, and I want you to remember it when we get to Easter, is that Jesus had predicted his own death and his own resurrection 3 days later. So I think that you can all remember that. I think you'll remember it better than some of us adults will. So I want to thank you for being here with me today. And I want you to share the story that Jesus died and was buried, and he resurrected on the third day, and he is still living. That is the most important part that we need to understand, that Jesus is living even today. And it's been great. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you. And I'll see you again next month. Goodbye.